Sunset, Louisiana is a major part of Cajun country. It's a point of pride for myself and most folks who've been brought up in and around that area of our state. Growing up in a multi-generational French-speaking household that was run solely by my maternal grandmother, where she cared for me, my brother, both of her ailing parents, and both of her brothers, one being completely disabled, where my mother, aunt, and uncle also grew up, nurtured major ties within me to the land in which this home was settled. The homestead was surrounded by farmland. We were sharecroppers and had always grown corn, potatoes, and strawberries. We had a tin box full of artifacts found from the fields, arrowheads, buttons, coins, marbles, and metal buckles we assumed were from the Civil War. But over the years, it was reduced to only a few of the coins. The other things were nabbed by cousins and family friends who wanted pieces of history. The home itself and the surrounding outbuildings were built by my great-grandfather's hands from scrap wood. Rarely anything bought, probably mostly just traded throughout the years. My great-grandfather, Edward Leger, Pappy, was a traiteur, in English, a treater, and faith healer in the Cajun community. Traiteurs use Catholic prayer and energy work to heal and treat the sick. Traiteurs have been compared to Reiki practitioners. The techniques are very similar. Growing up, there were always strangers around, sick strangers. As a kid, I didn't understand why, but never really asked questions. It was normal for us. I don't really remember a lot from that time in my life, as I was too young to even be in school yet, just playing in the yard and following my grandma around. Once I was old enough to realize this was in fact abnormal, I began asking questions about it. There were specific rituals, practices, guidelines, and rules that Pappy adhered to in order to honor his gift. My aunt had a particularly interesting piece of information from her memory of his practice when she was also a kid. My great-grandmother would beg Pappy to give it up. She was tired of having to nurse him back to health every time he would energetically take on these folks' illnesses. And she was tired of him not being compensated for his care, something forbidden when you have the traiteur gift. But sometimes there were other strangers there, a different type, not people who were searching for healing, but who were searching for something more tangible, treasure hunters, actual gold treasure hunters. The story, according to my family, is that the nearly 200-year-old live oaks in the backyard had some of the infamous Jean Lafitte's or Hippolyte Chretien's $650,000 gold treasure buried beneath them. Chretien was known to bury bits of his fortune amongst the property in addition to Lafitte. The circa 1835 Chretien Point plantation is approximately 3.2 miles northwest of my grandmother's property. Present-day Chretien Point is only about 20 acres. In its heyday, it was upwards of 3,000, some sources say 6,000, and some 10,000. In addition to this being an incredibly lucrative cotton plantation via the forced labor of 500 enslaved human beings, Chretien also allowed smugglers to use his land to distribute contraband in order for them to avoid taxes. One of the most infamous smugglers and pirates being Jean Lafitte, who became a friend and regular guest. In our backyard, there would be people with maps, metal detectors, and dowsing rods just seemingly roaming around. My grandma has a specific memory of one man named Stanley asking to explore the property. Stanley was a perfect stranger that she felt a bad energy from, but still allowed him access, albeit chaperoned by her nephew and her friend Mr. Dudley. Stanley came equipped with a metal detector, a chainsaw, and shovels. The device sensed something under or around the tree closest to the house. She said hours over the course of days were spent with Stanley digging and chopping at the roots of the tree until she was unable to see him underground. He dug a tunnel beneath the tree from one side to the other, and all the while the metal detector continued to sense something. She claims that he had a special type of device that could differentiate between gold and silver, but I'm unsure if this device exists, especially in the early 1990s. It would go off the closer to the house he would get. Unbeknownst to him, my great-grandma had a sack of silver dollars inside the wall closest to the tree, so it was no wonder to my grandmother why it was trilling like crazy. Yet he still claimed that it sensed gold. Obviously, he did not reach the treasure. Perhaps it didn't exist or was just too inaccessible. Once he'd thrown in the towel, my grandmother asked that he not return, as she was defenseless if he were to come continuing to seek the gold and harm us in order to do so. In addition to the earthly strangers frequenting our home and property, there were unearthly visitors as well, particularly in the proximity of the huge oak trees in the backyard. One visitor was so common that my grandmother gave him a name, George. If the history holds up, then George existed there before I was born, before my mother was born, and long before my grandmother or great-grandparents even owned the property. According to family legend, George's bones were beneath one of the oak trees resting beside Lafitte's treasure chest. As all those old pirates' tales go, only dead men can keep secrets. We, or my grandmother rather, surmised that George was tasked by Lafitte to dig the hole to bury the gold that unknowingly doubled as his grave, and he roamed around our backyard for over a century not knowing he was dead. But where did my grandma get the idea that George's tie to the property was to guard the rumored gold? Was Stanley's detector in fact only picking up the silver we had hidden in the wall of the house and only capable of a default detection alert? Or did it pick up gold as well? Was there even any gold at all? And if there wasn't gold, then who was George and what was he doing there? My grandma sticks to the claim that the detector accurately picked up silver in the wall, so the fact it had detected gold was proof of its existence. Metal detectors operate by generating an electromagnetic frequency that metals conduct. Conductive metals elicit a strong response, and silver seems to be the benchmark for conductivity, with gold registering slightly below it. So is it safe to say that metal detectors in the early 90s were not able to differentiate the two? George did exist. We'd see him in our peripheral as just a passing shape, and we'd feel his presence on a regular basis. My brother and I spent a lot of time playing on those massive root systems of the oak trees, as did my mother, aunt, and uncle as children. Those tree roots were particularly suited for the best games of cowboys, Indians, and Barbies that a child's mind could imagine. We also had a plank swing tethered to the lowest branch of the smaller tree. It was still at least 20 feet high. So many hours were spent playing there and consequently spent with George. George had an affinity for the plank swing. As anyone in South Louisiana knows, wind and even light breezes aren't really a thing unless there's a storm rolling through. Us kids could be on the other tree and the swing would just get going. Hi, George, and then we'd just continue on doing whatever we'd been doing. My grandma taught us not to be afraid of him, but I learned later that she was, in fact, the one who was afraid. She said her hair would stand up and she'd feel static electricity around her. I'd feel it too, and sometimes it felt like being inside of a bubble. George, however, wasn't the only energy haunting that space. We'd hear things too. On what seemed like almost a daily basis, we'd hear Dixieland coming from the field behind the oaks. Sometimes the music was clear and sometimes it was distorted, muffled. We could feel the rumbling of the music inside of our chests and stomachs. No one lived in the area there back then. My grandmother's homestead sat isolated on Chris Road except for 90-year-old Madame Verlies Hickenbottom, who lived at least 3/4 a mile away as the crow flies, and the incredibly impoverished folks, the Bros, who we suspected were several generations removed from the enslaved people who worked the same land in an almost uninhabitable cabin that housed those former enslaved across the road on the opposite side of where we'd hear the song. The Bros were employed by the Boannis, who owned the present-day cattle pastures that the Carencro Bayou meandered across. Chris Road, as in Mr. Chris Boanni, a family friend of ours. After Hippolyte Chretien died from yellow fever in 1839, Chretien Point remained in the Chretien family for 2 more generations until it went to Dr. Vincent Boanni, who passed it on to his son, who consequently sold it to the gardeners of Opelousas in 1899. Not only did our land used to be part of the Chretien Point plantation, soaked in the blood and pain of the enslaved, but it was also in the very close proximity of 2 Civil War battles. The Battle of Buzzard's Prairie, which was fought directly in front of the Chretien Point Big House. But present-day front. In plantation days, the front of the home was the part that faced the waterway, so that would have been Bayou Bourbeau. And the Battle of Carrion Crow Bayou, also known as the Battle of Bayou Carencro, Carrion Crow meaning buzzard, also known as the Battle of Grand Coteau, also known as the Battle of Bayou Bourbeau. A long stretch of Bayou Carencro runs parallel to the area of Chris Road where our home was. My grandmother claims that as children, she and her brother found the red brick foundation to an old home in addition to a cypress cistern on the field side of the oak trees. The home is suspected to have belonged to the overseer of the plantation. Pappy said when he was a child, he remembered a house still being there occupied by someone with the last name Miller. Pappy had also found human bones with Confederate uniform buttons in a shallow area of the yard while digging to install posts for a clothesline. These buttons were once in the tin box along with the old coins and things, but have since been given to whomever asked for them. I wasn't aware of any of the history as a kid, but I knew what I'd felt and I knew what I'd seen and I knew what I'd heard. I remember I felt as though it affected me more than anyone else in the family, and I'd asked my mom and grandmother a lot of questions regarding why it seemed like I heard and saw more than anyone else. Things would come to me in my dreams often. This also happened to my mother. Location-specific dreams were reoccurring, something in the field behind the oak trees, all the time. My grandmother explained to me that it was because I was still so close to the other side, because I was a child and had just crossed over into our physical dimension, and also that children were not as tainted by societal beliefs and standards as adults were. Meaning we were still open-minded. I was 5 years old, but understood what she meant immediately. My family were spiritual people. My great-grandparents had chosen to participate in the organized religion of most Cajuns, Catholicism, but they were spiritual in different ways as well, connected to the earth and to the people. Pappy was a traiteur, and his wife, Mamam, was half Chitimacha. She was very connected to her land and the benefits of the flora around her. Pappy had the gift of healing, which was a natural God-given ability in addition to being very dependent on Catholicism and its rigid systems. This gift is said to be passed down in family lines. So perhaps we all have a bit of it in us, but we're not aware enough to nurture it. So I'd understood these things at an early age because it was just my existence, but it fueled my obsession with the paranormal for years to come. I'd rent every book I could find on ghost stories from the library. I'd ask my mom and dad to bring me to bookstores and buy books about ghost hunting, eyewitness accounts, and folklore. I'd watch any TV program about ghost hunting and haunting reenactments and psychics. But just recently, after years and years of reading and learning, I had an interesting revelation. Were we haunting our own land? There's something to be said about energy and how it only changes forms but never disappears. Pappy used energy work to heal the sick, but that was fueled by belief too, wasn't it? Unless, of course, it was completely real, in which case he had the ability to harness his energy and use it in a way to heal the human body. But what happens to the unharnessed energy? If a person has excess energy and also possesses the ability to direct it, what happens when they direct it toward the wrong things, consciously or subconsciously? If all my family possessed this ability to harness energy and our third eyes were more open than other folks, then had our collective energy and beliefs and more or less fabricated stories surrounding these hauntings fuel or even flat out create them. There's something in the field of parapsychology called PK manifestation, or psychokinesis. I think of it as psychokinetic manifestation, influencing a physical system without physical interaction. This phenomenon is specific to people with unknown psychic abilities. It's usually associated with adolescents going through puberty, which is a tense and confusing time where emotions run high. But I feel as though it isn't age-specific. Strong enough emotion, intention, and things like mass thought can direct energy into forming its own entity, sometimes called a poltergeist. Poltergeists are generally negative, but they aren't intelligent beings. They're just a personified conglomerate of emotions. But with people who are aware of this ability, it doesn't have to be. Take Pappy, for instance. He healed people by using energy in addition to his and their belief that they would be cured, and they would be. George isn't there anymore. And according to my grandmother, one day she was so spooked by him that she said aloud, "George, go home to your mama, go home." And that was the end of that. Had she moved him on, or had she convinced herself that she got rid of him by just believing that she had? And by believing that she had gotten rid of him, had the energy she put forth in order to do so in fact ceased his existence that maybe had never been real in the first place? So was George just the ghost in a ghost story that we had all collectively made up and chosen to believe in? Had we just forged our own narrative surrounding his presence and then breathed life into the story, which in turn perpetuated this haunting? Was he real in the way that we told the story? Did he as an intelligent spirit ever really exist, or had we completely created him? The fact that he stopped existing to all of us after my grandma told him to go still doesn't bring us the answer of if he had existed as his own entity or if we PK'd him into existence. And if our collective belief that he had gone home and wasn't there anymore cut off the energy supply that we manifested into a haunting, we'd stopped hearing Dixieland in the field right around the same time, but consequently the area was becoming more populated. My great-grandparents passed away within a few years of each other in the 90s. A subdivision was made on the other side of the field. My grandma sold some acreage behind the house, and a trailer park was built on the other side. Maybe all the new energy snuffed out the old one, or maybe we had just been so isolated back there that we made stuff up to entertain ourselves. The property is pure peace and quiet now, but definitely very lonesome. Only my grandma and aunt live there now in a trailer my aunt purchased probably about a decade ago, and sadly the family doesn't visit as often as we used to. I can't help but wonder, though, if while preparing this project, when I asked all these questions and gathered the photos and walked around all the old hotspots, if maybe something woke up. As my grandma said, there's an eerie feeling back near the oaks again, or has her memory just been sparked?